Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être avec nous. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. Je suis Annie Gérin, la doyenne de la Faculté des Beaux-Arts de l'Université Concordia. J'aimerais commencer par reconnaître que l'Université Concordia est située en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. The Ganyangahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and the waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, or Montréal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other people. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations continues entre les peuples autochtones et autres personnes de nos communautés. Nous célébrons cette année le 50e anniversaire de Concordia. Until June 2025, we celebrate our community of 260,000 alumni, 50,000 students, and 7,000 faculty and staff. Concordia's 50th anniversary also marks another significant milestone, the creation of the Faculty of Fine Arts in 1974. Avec 9 départements, notre faculté est la plus importante en son genre au Canada. Nous sommes classés parmi les 100 meilleures écoles d'art et de design au monde par le QS World University Rankings et parmi les 2 meilleurs au Canada. Our fine arts alumni are active around the world, with many receiving virtually every major accolade from Academy Awards, Tony Awards, Emmys, Grammys, Golden Globes, Sobies, and Governor General's Awards. Among our many points of pride, several departments, including the Department of Art History, have developed highly sought-after expertise. The very recent launch of the new graduate certificate and micro-program in curatorial studies and practices reflects this ongoing development, offering students hands-on experience and a direct connection to leading curatorial professionals. And I'll add that these programs are the first and only curatorial studies and practices programs offered in universities in Quebec. So we're very, very pleased with this. Ces programmes s'ancrent dans notre engagement envers l'implication communautaire, l'apprentissage expérientiel et le développement de pratiques commissariales innovantes et inclusives. Et l'événement d'aujourd'hui incarne d'ailleurs le dialogue critique et l'échange professionnel que ces programmes visent à inculquer à nos étudiants en leur offrant un accès direct aux figures majeures en art et en pratique commissariale. Today's lecture, presented in collaboration with the MAC, the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montréal, and featuring Candice Hopkins, Chief Curator and Executive Director of Forge Project, is part of a series of 2 major public lectures on contemporary art curation hosted by the MAC. This collaboration between the MAC and Concordia exemplifies the type of partnership that we will continue to shape and enrich for our new programs, connecting students with the most pressing conversations and practices in the field today. Now, without further ado, let me introduce François Letourneux, conservateur et responsable de l'action culturelle au MAC et qui apporte son expertise inestimable ce soir. François' extensive experience in curating groundbreaking exhibitions and leading curatorial critical conversations in contemporary art provides an important model for emerging curators. So on this, à toi François, je te laisse la parole.
Merci.
Et bonne conférence tout le monde.
Many thanks for your warm introduction, Annie. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous.
I think you got to use the hand mic.
Oh, this one?
Hello?
Yeah,
Okay, great.
Ravi de vous voir toutes et tous ici ce soir. C'est un réel plaisir de vous accueillir pour cette conférence de la commissaire d'exposition Candice Hopkins, que j'aimerais remercier de tout cœur de sa présence parmi nous. We'd like to express our most heartfelt gratitude to you, dear Candice, for accepting our invitation to speak in Montreal tonight. Needless to say, we feel quite honored and incredibly lucky to hear your thoughts on art and curatorial practice today. I'm sure many in this room have been looking forward to this occasion for a very long time as well. J'aimerais remercier Annie Gérin, doyenne de la Faculté des Beaux-Arts, ainsi que Nicolas Pézolet, directeur du département d'Histoire de l'Art, d'avoir joint leurs efforts aux nôtres dans le cadre de ce projet. We'd also like to thank Rebecca Duclos, as well as Alice Ming Wai Jim, Michelle McGough, and Joanna Joachim, with our most enthusiastic congratulations on the launch of this promising new graduate certificate and micro-program in curatorial studies and practices. We are certain it will provide many more opportunities for Concordia and MAC to collaborate. Many thanks as well to Fanny Gadouas, Danielle Miles, and Pascal Dupuis for facilitating the organization of this conference. It's been a decade since the MAC last welcomed Candice. This was on the occasion of a symposium she organized in connection with the exhibition Beat Nation, titled The Culture Makers, Conversations on Art and Cultural Adaptation, which had brought together speakers such as Marcia Crosby, Dylan Miner, and Marianne Nicholson. Many things have happened since, of course, and we thought it would be most fascinating at this point to hear Candice on her recent thoughts on curatorial methodology. I should add that this invitation comes out of a particular context where we at the MAC have been working out of a temporary site for the last few years, as you all may know, and looking towards the reintegration of our fully transformed museum in 2027. The talk is part of a series of workshops and events we're holding to help us think about the institutional challenges curators will be facing over the next decade. We are particularly interested in exploring what it means to curate in an institution today and new ideas for institutional models, and in this particular instance, very curious, of course, to find out about Candice's recent work at Forge. Please note that we will also be welcoming Whitney curator Meg Only next week at McGill University. You can find all the details on our website. She'll be discussing the 2024 Whitney Biennial. I'd also like to thank Skawanati very warmly for her recent conversations with us and for agreeing to introduce Candice today. So again, thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and on to you, Skawanati.
Sega seo gwego Skawanati niwaksanoda gahnawagi nidiwagenu netzi jochage gitoro. I am the lucky person who gets to introduce Candice. I have known Candice for quite a while. We determined today that it was 1999, Walter Phillips Gallery, Banff. We met, Glide Hall. And I've been so, I can't read with my glasses on, and I can't see you with them off, sadly. Our paths have crossed a few times since then, and I've watched from afar with pleasure and pride, as I wrote she, but as you, Candice, have become a respected force in the contemporary art world. Allow me to read her bio to you. Candice Hopkins is a citizen of Clarcross Tagish First Nation and lives in Milan, New York. Her writing and curatorial practice explore the intersections of history, contemporary art, and indigeneity. She is executive director and chief curator of Forge Project, which is in Taghkanic, I should know how to say it, Taghkanic, New York. She's curator of the exhibitions Indian Theater, Native Performance, Art and Self-Determination since 1969 at the Hessel Museum, semicolon. Impossible Music, co-curated with Raven Chacon and Stavia Grimani. I didn't check the pronunciation there, sorry. At the Miller ICA, and the touring exhibitions Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts, co-curated with Dylan Robinson, and Double Vision, featuring textiles, prints, and drawings by Jessie Ornock and her daughters Janet and Victoria. She was the senior curator for the inaugural 2019 and 2022 editions of the Toronto Biennale of Art, and part of the curatorial team for the Canadian Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale, featuring the work of the media collective Izuma, semicolon. Documenta 14, Athens and Castle, semicolon, Sakahan, International Indigenous Art, National Gallery of Canada, Ottawa, period. Her notable essays include The Gilded Gaze, Wealth and Economies on the Colonial Frontier, in Documenta 14 Reader, Outlawed Social Life, in South as State of Mind, and The Appropriation Debates, or the Gallows of History, in Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value, from New Museum, MIT Press in 2020. Candice, I'm very pleased to welcome you to my territory and to this stage. I'm so looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us. So without further ado, what gwanuaradu, Candice?
Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you for that introduction, Scounati. Thank you, Francois and the Musée Contemporain for inviting me here. Thank you, Concordia, for being my host. It's nice to be back in these territories. So when I was speaking with Francois and Mark about today, one of the things that they shared was they were interested in not only different curatorial models, but how curatorial practice can impact or maybe even reshape institutions. So that's a bit of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I wanted to begin first, though, with an exhibition where we tried to create a different curatorial methodology, a different framework, and one in which I still use for many of the projects that I do now. This is just a title slide, it's not important. So this was a project that began a couple of years before the pandemic started. Co-curated by a longtime collaborative of mine, Dr. Dylan Robinson-Hustala, who's now best known for an incredible book called Hungry Listening. Dylan is trained as an ethnomusicologist and one of the few people that I know and collaborate with who also has a deep knowledge of experimental music and scores, particularly scores that originated during the 1950s, 1960s, text scores that were part of the Fluxus movement. I think Fluxus has been both an inspiration for both of us. We were interested then in this question. So, number one, I think it's interesting when exhibitions emerge from questions. And here was ours. How can a score be a tool for decolonization? So it's a question that we asked ourselves. It's also a question that we asked the artists that we worked with as collaborators. It's a question that we asked also for the framework of the exhibition itself. So that's how Soundings was born. It was born first from us working together at the Agnes Etherington in Kingston, New York. We always imagined that this would be an exhibition that would change and evolve over time, and it certainly has. One of its final venues will likely be 516 Arts in Albuquerque, New Mexico, collaborating with the Poe Cultural Center, which is on Pohuaque Pueblo, a kind of fitting end for this multi-year tour. So in order to begin the exhibition, Dylan and I co-authored a score, and this is a score that evolves. Every time the exhibition is shown, we write a different score as a form of introduction. It's always in 5 parts. Every time the exhibition is shown, we also write a different score for the outside of the building as well, because we understand that that's also a place of resonance. It's also a place of meaning. And I'll just read you a little bit of this. This is from when it was shown at the Agnes Etherington. So part 1, listen to these rooms. Hear material friction of beads upon glass, upon metal. Follow a map charting fictive cities of the colonial imaginary. Hold space for the future gatherings of other belongings. Give intimate attention to the life of these working drums. caressing lines of wrinkle and scar. Respond to, construct, destruct, sound, event, symbols of history. Part 2, dropped beads amplify elsewhere, the beaded pattern is sewn together. The Thanksgiving address moves through space, reminding, resounding. The skin of drums resonate, sung through the voices of wood. Others arrive. In part 3, we hear bow rasp upon string. We hear breath, a heartbeat. The sky somewhere home when we were trees. We hear a small collective of others' voices around a fire. In part 4, sense towards the touch of this life, sense towards ancestors. In part 5, actions continue elsewhere. So being an exhibition that's framed around a score means that these kinds of actions also charted how you experience the exhibition itself. So when it's first installed, it's stalled, in fact, in 5 stages. It begins with the scores. Then slowly over the course of the exhibition, the artworks populate the space. Then performers come, they respond to the spaces. Sometimes the traces of those performances are left there for others to experience. And sometimes new works are made out of those interactions that become part of the tour. And this is the audio of one of those new works by Olivia Wheaton. So anyone who's a bead marker might hear that sound with a certain degree of anxiety because that's the sound of falling beads. So Olivia, this is Olivia's score. Follow the layers as a pattern, listen to the beads drop and echo. And as a viewer or as a participant, you can choose different colors to drop into this glass. And that's the sound that it makes because this entire installation has been turned into an instrument. So the metal is amplified by a contact mic. And then Olivia beads the remains, which then look like noise. And every time the exhibition tours, she loom beads a new piece, and it gets added to and added to. And every time the exhibition is shown, new beads resonate. You know, one of the most important gestures we thought about, Dylan and I thought about at the beginning of this, was not only what does it mean to hear, but what does it mean to listen, particularly in spaces where, and I would say museums can be guilty of this. Spaces that aren't necessarily that reflective or reflexive, spaces that don't necessarily listen. This is a beautiful audio installation, and when you take up the pamphlet, it guides you through the different parts of the audio. And it was a kind of counter audio guide to the Agnes Etherington's collection. And they quite famously have a number of Rembrandts, including quite a famous portrait. And when you get to that room of the Rembrandts, Sebastian's voice gets very frenetic, and you hear his footsteps start to quicken, and then they run around the room, and you realize that he's running in front of those Rembrandts. But I think what he's trying to do is make them pay attention. This is a work by Tanya Willard, and we gathered a little more than a year in advance of the exhibition. And Dylan and I have been doing these gatherings for a number of years. This was our third or fourth one. We don't like the word symposium. It's too academic. People aren't that enthusiastic about coming to symposiums necessarily. Maybe some of you are. We're much more enthusiastic about coming to gatherings. And again, when we would gather, we'd gather around these different questions. So, you know, each time we brought artists together, we brought them together around a question. And one of the questions that we had was, what might be an Indigenous score? You know, people took that home in different ways. Tanya, who lives on Secwepemc Nation, took it home, and she was thinking about the rhythm and the sound of wood she was chopping. They heat their home from a wood fire, so, you know, chopping wood is pretty much a daily activity in the winter. But then she was really inspired by the shapes of the wood pile and thinking about how it might be possible that those might be played, that those become a score. And then she was thinking about, what does it mean to, you know, overlay beadwork over staff paper? What might that sound like? So every time this work is shown, it's performed by different musicians as well. But another question came in, and that was from Tanya Lucan Linklater, and that is how traditional belongings like this one, this is a gut parka that is in the collection of the Manitoba Museum of Man in Winnipeg, how it might also be a score. It's of course a pattern. It was made for a specific person, for the exact contours of their body, so it could be waterproof. She was interested in how the lines might be articulated, how the duck feathers might sound. And she started this process of, you know, thinking about how embodiment might be a form of repatriation. So not just the return of the physical return of our belongings, but what does it mean to have different protocols of engagement? What does it mean to think of embodiment as a kind of form of non-colonial practice? So when we found this particular gut parka, we originally wanted one from the Met, and they wouldn't lend it to us, but we found a willing lender. It wasn't just about finding a willing lender. Tanya went to the museum because she thought it was very important to go there and to ask its permission if it wanted to make the journey to Kingston, Ontario, if it wanted to engage in this collaboration. So she asked its permission, but she also wanted to get to know it, a kind of intimacy of engagement, let's say. Because her process is very particular. She works durationally. She's trained as a choreographer. She often works with the same collaborators, specific dancers and musicians, in this case Kaiwin Gobert and Dana Rosales, as well as the Apache violinist Laura Ortman. And through a week, they spent time with this parka, and then they created a new work, a rather extraordinary new work that was performed and sounded on the banks of the Great Lake. And what Tanya was able to do was this idea of what I consider to be repatriation otherwise. So repatriation not just focused on the return of our belongings, because sometimes that can be a bit of a false endgame, but thinking about how repatriation, as I mentioned before, is an embodied practice. It's a practice that's based on protocols. It's a practice where we can also gain some sense of agency, some sense of intimacy with our belongings, even when they're not in their homes and when they're on the steel shelves of museums. This is Peter Morin. Those were drums that he took portraits of. He was interested in the drums themselves as portraits, not just of the people that made them, but portraits in and of themselves, and how those themselves could be performed by musicians. And here they are with Pamela Atawara. And Cheryl Rondell has been creating these homages to these significant rock forms in different locations. The final one will be at Poake Pueblo. This one is a rock that's dedicated to the Thanksgiving address. And then she worked with Jan Hill, an amazing knowledge keeper who's in Kingston, Ontario, to recite it. And then she turned that into Melodyne score. This was a score for a new video by Raven Chacon and Cristobal Martinez, a song often played on the radio that centers on these two figures who are, in a way, both seeking the wrong thing in the lands of New Mexico, where when the Spanish first came north, they were chasing a fictive city called Cibola, a myth that had followed them from Europe, a myth of the fabled 7 cities of gold, which didn't exactly exist. And I want to play the trailer for you now.
Dime con quién te juntas y te digo quién eres. Quiere pasar la sequía antes de llegar al puente. Candil de la calle, oscuridad de su casa.
So Raven and Cristobal's score is a kind of false map. Again, a way to show the fact that despite all of their maps, the Spanish were often wrong in where they were headed. And this piece, the two main characters are Nacho Mendez, who's an incredible musician, singer, performer who lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Guillermo Gomez Peña, the mestizo performance artist who lives half the time in Mexico City and half the time in San Francisco in the Bay Area. Quite famously, if you don't know Guillermo's story, when he was accepted into art school at Cal Arts in Los Angeles, he walked there from Mexico. That was his first performance. Heidi Sinungatuk is an incredible musician, composer, violinist. When she first came to the Agnes Etherington, and I think this is a kind of typical story, she thought it was so curious that there were so many belongings from her area in Alaska, but there was so little in the archives about them. So she worked with her dad, the late incredible curator and knowledge keeper Rong Sinungatuk, to bring knowledge about these items that was then shared back with the Agnes Etherington. But importantly as well, Heidi performed for them. So the pieces themselves became animate. They became animate with sound. They became animate with the sound of her playing a violin. And she relayed in our workshop, in our gathering that we did the year before the exhibition, that often she approaches classical music this way, where she thinks about the words in Inupiaq that the sounds remind her of. And then the piece becomes representative of that, so kind of sonic transliteration. This is a beautiful net, beaded net by Camille Georgeson Usher. And every time the exhibition travels, Dylan and I have written a curatorial score, and what the curatorial score is it's about custodianship. And it's about community relations. And it wasn't meant to be a test, but it became a test for some institutions, because we asked them to commission a new work by an Indigenous artist, an artist of color, to become part of the ensemble that is the exhibition. And the first time we toured it, it was to an institution in the United States and they said, you know, we actually don't have those relations. So in a way it exposed something, but it exposed an area of need. We haven't run into that since. But Germaine was an artist who was invited to be part of its iteration at the University of British Columbia. And she was really interested in, one, how to expand the idea of who we might think of are the players or the performers, and how that might amplify conditions that are in the local environment. So she used tree trunks, hollowed them out, stretched them with a drum skin, tuned it so that it was taut, and then marked on the calendar the days where there was anticipated rain. So the rain could be the drummer. This piece doesn't work as well in the desert, but sometimes we we have downfalls. In some cases, the curators also become performers. This is an example of this. This is Lorna Brown, who's at the University of British Columbia, performing a work by Greg Stotts, Doga, which is a very personal piece for the artist. But what he was interested in was kind of transferring that personal narrative to the curator and almost creating a kind of sense of vulnerability in that space, but also to call attention to often we're the ones behind the scenes, kind of doing the things, but we're not necessarily the ones performing in front of the audience. And a score by Raven Chacon called American Ledger. It's been performed differently in every location with always a fairly fair-sized ensemble. This was with students of music at the University of British Columbia. Also with traditional instruments, percussive instruments, but also instruments that they made. And of course, I think every good exhibition should start with a procession, especially a procession with the local community. And this is the first time this had ever happened where Musqueam folks had opened an exhibition in this way. So here's everyone at the University of British Columbia. Here's the exhibition being welcomed, opened. And I think for us, you know, what we're left with as the exhibition continues to tour is to think about ways in which, or I think about ways in which my curatorial practice creates these kinds of ensembles of voices. How exhibitions can be stages. They're certainly platforms. Who do you bring in? How are folks platformed? You know, whose voices are amplified? Whose voices do we hear? So these are kinds of questions that are foreground my work now, as well as I've shifted to being the director of an institution. I have to say that as a curator, I successfully avoided being a permanent hire at any major museum for my entire career. I don't think that it's a good career strategy, but it's the path that I took. In part, I think because I didn't want to feel like I ever had to speak through their voice. I think sometimes institutions, there's the expectation that you become a kind of ventriloquist. That was never something that I wanted to do as a curator. So when I was invited to come to this very new institution, Forge only began in April of 2021 with the acquisition of 2 buildings and 40 acres of property. And it had a kind of small collection of contemporary native art. And they were also collaborating with a local farm that had been started by an artist, Dan Colin and Sky High Farms. I was really intrigued because it wasn't a typical model, because it wasn't really a model, it was just an idea. It seemed like there was a lot of space to kind of think about how it could be responsive. And for me, it was a return to Mohikanic homelands, which is many people call the Hudson Valley, but it's actually the Mahikanatuk. So I lived in this region between 2001 and 2003. I have to say that when I lived there, it was a place of incredible Indigenous absence. Most of the people, if you ask them who are your local custodians, they wouldn't have been able to answer. So there was an incredible vacuum there. And I think sometimes that kind of sense of a vacuum can be daunting. Often when there's vacuums like that, what comes to fill it is also a lot of misinformation or other people's stories, layers and layers and layers of other people's stories. And I think that's what happened here. But I think at Forge, we're really interested in how do we create a different model that's not only honoring a homelands, but thinking about how can a homelands have a different form of agency now. This is how you enter our website, understanding that you're entering Mohikaniac land and homeland. We're interested in like how can we have non-extractive relationships with a lot of the collaborators that we have, and I think this is a really important question to ask, for any major institution that's collaborating with a Native community or a Native curator or a Native artist. I also wanted to foreground, as I am just a guest, actually an uninvited guest in these lands, I've been doing a lot of research. One of the figures that's really interesting who comes from this area, a really important Mohican leader, is John Quinney, and this is a painting of him by none other than George Catlin. He was really specific in saying that his people's lands had never been given up. But this is a place also that's really thick with projection. It's the birth of the Hudson River School painters. This is none other than Thomas Cole. It's a kind of self-portrait, so he's there in that cape, kind of looking at the lands that are seemingly uninhabited except for settlers, and beautiful and pristine and tended, because these lands had been beautiful and pristine and tended for thousands of years. So these kinds of paintings kind of worked hand in hand with the forced removal of Mohican folks and other people from this region, which started in the late 1600s. And then Mohican people were forcibly removed 7 times all the way to Wisconsin. So these paintings went very far in creating this idea of settler desire. But then Thomas Cole was also best friends with James Fenimore Cooper, who was the author of none other than The Last of the Mohicans. So he also painted these scenes so that he could kind of project his kind of desire on what he thought of was a dying race, which is not true at all. So I think that at Forge, and this is us at Forge, one of the most radical things we can do there is gather as Native people. Gather in lands where people haven't for a really long time. But also think about, with that gathering, how do we establish new relations so that these are a kind of framework for others, so that there's also a sense of responsibility here. Who are we doing this for? This is we just call this the main house. It was both the buildings that we are in were designed by the artist and activist Ai Weiwei for a collector who originally commissioned them back in 2006. And the homes were simply on the market when Forge began. So one of the first things that we did too was thinking about, us now as temporary custodians of this place, we need to make this land healthy. We are stewards of this land now, so how do we do that? Because the whole thing, as Forge co-founder Zach Foyer said, he said the whole thing used to look like a mown golf course, and it did. So we started working with Misty Cook, who's wrote an amazing book called Medicine Generation. She's a Mohican plant knowledge holder. She's been apprenticing now for more than 40 years. So we asked her advice. She came did a plant analysis at Forge to see what was there. And by this point, we had done the first action, and the first action was to simply stop mowing. Since then, we've worked with an allied botanist and an allied landscape architect to develop a longer-term plan for both the remediation and then the later rematriation of this land. So it looks and sounds very different now. And we host a fellowship. And when this fellowship was designed, this is the first cohort in 2021, and it's Brock Schreiber who's there on the left. So his life goal is to be the first in generations to raise children who grew up speaking Mohican as their first language. Mohican's still considered a sleeping language. So this is his life's work. And beside him is Chris Cornelius, who's an Oneida architect, the first native chair of any architecture program in US history. He's at University of New Mexico. And beside him is Sky Hopinka, Luceño and Ho-Chunk, amazing poet and video artist. And beside Sky is Jasmine Niosh. And Jasmine Niosh is an activist and a legal scholar, and someone who knows more about and critiques the Enlightenment than anyone that I've ever met. She's very effective at it. And so here we are. They were meeting for the first time, but they were all our inaugural cohort of fellows. So every year we open up a fellowship application. Fellows come and they can spend up to 3 weeks at Forge. One of the things that we asked ourselves early on is, how do we have non-extractive relationships with the people who are spending time here, and also for people like Brock spending time in their homelands? So it's not based on what you will produce when you're there. We don't do things like a lot of artist residencies do, which I think is highly problematic, where if you're given a spot in a residency, you're asked to create a work that becomes then part of the collection of the residency. I think that's also highly extractive. You receive a cash award. It's $25,000 with no strings attached. So you can do anything that you need or want with that money. Some people have used it for, their own practices. Some people have used it to help prop up families. Some people have used it to, help with a mortgage payment. It really doesn't matter to us, and I think that that's really important. Is, we want to support people where they're at, and we want to give people time and space, and I think that's what Forge offers. So this is Laura Ortman. It doesn't mean that people don't do things, because everyone comes with big plans for the most part. So Laura Ortman, amazing Apache violinist who Tanya Lucan Linklater was also collaborating with, was scoring a new series for Showtime that was directed by Rizal Ben Ali, who's an amazing Lakota and Dene director. And the series is on the murdered and missing Indigenous peoples epidemic. But for Laura, the fact that she could see the land as she was recording, this is in the guest house, was really important. And she was able to record and score pretty much the entire show over the 3 weeks that she was there. We also have a lending collection of contemporary Native art. We focus on the work of living Native artists for a few reasons. One, because we want it to be a direct investment in their work. We want it to be a direct investment in their career. And also because up until not that long ago, most Native artists that I had worked with had no gallery representation, so we were always self-representing. And one of the things that we use the collection for is to generate knowledge. So we do a lot of tours at Forge, but when we do tours, we don't want our labor to be free. So we charge a fee for people to visit, but 50% of that fee goes back to Stockbridge-Muncie community. So we do a direct deposit a few times a year. And that's really important to us. It's not exactly reparations. It's not exactly a kind of land tax, but it's a kind of simple thing that institutions could do to pay homage or pay it back to the people whose land they're on, often tax-free. And because of that, and through the work of my colleague Sarah Biscara-Dilley, who's the Director of Indigenous Programs and Relationality, and Sarah's colleague, Halle Mahone, they've been working with Lil Deb's. It's a local restaurant, and now Lil Deb's charges a plate fee, 75 cents on a plate, that then they also donate back to Stockbridge-Munsee community. I think that these are all kind of methods that we could use, that universities could use to give back, that museums could use to give back. So I think one of the things that Forge has shown me as a curator is we can use this as a way of generating these different models and then try to see what is catching, let's say. Part of the reason also that we concentrate on the work of living Native artists is because Native art is a massive economy, but the biggest investment is in our cultural wealth, so our cultural belongings, which from my perspective have become trafficable. So most of them are in private hands. They get sold to other collectors. Those collectors benefit. You know, these are things that have been taken from graves. These are things that were sold under duress. These were things that were outright stolen in some cases with informants as well. So what I really like to do, especially when I do tours for museums or donors, is talk about why we do certain things in the collection the way that we do, and I'll share more about that in a bit. But again, we don't always gather. We don't only gather. We share a lot of great food, and this is folks from Lil Deb's, and we're making incredible tamales. And then another thing that we've done is I've been thinking a long time about land acknowledgements. I've been thinking about their efficacy. I've been thinking about their adoption at an institutional level and what that means. I've been thinking about what it means to be acknowledged, but to never kind of have a kind of share in that institutional profit, let's say. So we've been working towards this for quite some time, and Sarah Biscara-Dilley has really taken the lead. And we have a land acknowledgement. You saw that on our website. We don't really give land acknowledgements at events because we really show our relationship through our actions. And so we worked for 2 years on developing a memorandum of understanding with Stockbridge-Munsee community, with the tribe, that outlines our shared goals, our shared relations, our shared activities. It means that 2 of the fellows that we have at Forge Project are always from Stockbridge-Munsee community. It means that any intellectual property that we generate at Forge is given also to Stockbridge-Munsee community. So any artist talk, we give a copy to the library. Any journal article, we have an online journal called Forging, which any of you can write for. We pay $1 a word because we're trying to set different standards, especially in the United States. So those are also given, copies are given over as well. But a big part of that was the appendices of the MOU. And Sarah and Monique worked, and this is Monique Tyndall, so Monique is our compatriot at Stockbridge-Munsee community. Monique is the Director of Cultural Affairs there. They developed an appendix on Indigenous intellectual property that is an appendix that can be used for any legal document that the tribe creates with any other body, so that it protects Indigenous intellectual property. You might not think that this is part of curatorial work, but it absolutely is. And I'm really proud of what we've been able to do together. And so this is my colleague Paloma Wage, who's our strategy and operations manager, visiting the farm at Stockbridge-Munsee community. In the year that I visited, which is a couple of years ago, the community had developed 13,000 pounds of fresh food that then they sell in front of the tribal offices for very accessible, amounts. You can get 5 squash for $1, things like that. But they've also been enacting a lot of seed saving. This is Monique at the library. This is Misty and Misty's daughter, Coral Cook, leading a plant walk at Forge. This is Lucy Burr-Grignon, who was a fellow last year, who runs a seed project as well, back in her homelands, and her daughter, with the little shirt that says Tiny Elder. This is Lucy's daughter sharing the seeds with Sarah. Blue corn. We also, together with MOMIS, and I know Sky is here, led an incredible program with Leili Ashrage as the lead, called Estuaries, and it was a residency on art criticism. And I won't go into it deep, but one of the things that we all really appreciated of this moment is, us as Indigenous writers and scholars from around the world, we were able to gather in a way where there was a kind of shorthand that was really freeing. Because I think for a lot of Native people, we always feel like there has to be a kind of the burden of introduction where you kind of give a longer history lesson to settler audiences. And we didn't have to do this here. And it was also the first time Forge has a saltwater pool. It's the first time we were able to do a teach-in in the saltwater pool. And Leili and I have this business idea, if anyone wants to partner with us, where it's a new kind of short called Water Back. Back is on the back, water's on the front. We're looking for partners on that. We like to do merch at Forge. This is a 2022 SNC fellow, Rainer Paulsolt, and Rainer works in mental health. He's a really important person because he's interested in, through his work, and he's working on his PhD now, how do you, in mental health, not only break the cycle of trauma, but create new protocols for health, by and for Indigenous people that can then be enacted in community. So he's really working on that now. So getting back to the collection. So we think of the collection as ways of reducing barriers to access. We turn loan requests around pretty quickly if it makes sense. We always let artists know when there was a request for their work so they know what context it's going into, so there's the opportunity to say no if that doesn't work for them. We only lend to exhibitions that pay artist fees. And in Canada, this is the norm, but it's actually not the norm in the United States. So we use that as a kind of form of leverage. And every now and again, we also lend to for-profit entities. So this was an episode of Rutherford Falls, which featured the artist Natalie Ball. And we talked about it a lot, and then we decided, we should actually charge a fee. They're making money off this show. It's a pretty good show. So we charged them a fee, but in doing that, we first talked to Natalie about where she wanted to direct that money. And at the time, they were still fighting. They hadn't had the agreement yet on the removal of the 4 dams on the Klamath River. So that money was then directed towards that fight. And I think that these are ways that collections can not only form kind of leverage, let's say, but we're okay using it as a bargaining chip if it's going to make a difference in the community that an artist is working. And this is the work that was featured on Rutherford Falls. And the way that we've organized the collection is that anything that's updated on the back end is actually updated live on our website. So all the details that we might have on an artwork are available, so fully accessible and in real time. We're now working together with the Center for Cultural Studies at Bard College to develop more writing and artist interviews around this work as well. This is just what it looks like when you're kind of searching some of the home pages. But we also started to develop exhibitions out of the collection. So I think every 5 years or so, we'll develop a major exhibition. And I know I've been invited here too to kind of give my thoughts on curatorial practice, maybe a state of the field. One of the things that one of my colleagues, Kathleen Ash-Milby, told me quite a number of years ago when I was working on an exhibition, and she said, please don't do one of those exhibitions of contemporary Native art that has work from the last 5 years and kind of no substance behind it. Not no substance behind the work, but no substance behind the curatorial idea. Because she said what's been happening is, especially in the United States, we're in the kind of state of perpetual introduction, where Indigenous art in that context then always feels like it's an introduction. So there's that model, and one that I've tried to reject. And then there's another model, which is a kind of selective inclusion, which is where you do a kind of major monographic exhibition, maybe once in the lifetime of a museum if you're the Whitney. Although they included Natalie Ball in the project space last year, so they're kind of changing that up. MoMA did their last group show of Native art in 1943. So we have a lot of work to do south of the border. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is, developing these rigorous historical exhibitions that kind of start at a very particular point, and tell a history of Native art. And I know that this happens really at regional museums throughout the US, like in the Southwest, at the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, or at the Denver Art Museum, or in Seattle, the Seattle Art Museum, let's say, or at the Eiteljorg. But this really hasn't been taking place, certainly in the Northeast. And so when I started working on this exhibition, Indian Theater, which is named after a document that's called Indian Theater, an Artistic Experiment in Process, that was published by the Institute of American Indian Arts in 1969. And it was co-authored by Lloyd Kiva-New, who was the first president of IAI, who was actually a really famous fashion designer. And he had the Kiva Craft Center in Scottsdale before he moved to Santa Fe to start up IAI. And Roland Meinholz, who was non-native, but he was the director of drama and dance there, together with IAI students. So they wrote this treatise, which for me, ever since I encountered that document, it was first in 2014 when I was living in New Mexico, I've been thinking about it because I was thinking about how radical this vision was. But I was also thinking about how radical our vision is as Native artists, and how the idea of self-determination and agency has been at the foreground of all of the art that we do. So this is the document, 1969, Indian Theater. And in these notes on Indian Theater, what Roland Meinholz is doing together with Rosalie Jones, who some of you might know, who was one of the students then, Lloyd Kiva-New, Henry Gobin, is really thinking about what Native theater could be, what contemporary Native theater could be, what they were calling new Native theater could be. And in order to do that, they thought that it was important to really think of it as a kind of space of speculation. And so that's why he wrote these notes. So there's notes on form. For example, what an evening of Indian theater might look like, what it might sound like, what it might feel like, what its narrative arc might be, what its setting might be, what the stage might look like. They're very particular, though. In some cases, they had some rules. Here, they said that the stage should be designed to be non-scenic. We have no example in the entire range of Indian culture of a scenic stage, they say. But then they worked together with Paolo Soleri, the visionary architect. And Paolo Soleri hadn't yet made Arco Santi, but he had made this. So this was his Indian theater. So this was being built in 1969 as they were developing this document, this extraordinary both in, kind of interior and exterior theater space that's still standing. It's now something of a historical monument in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is some of the earliest performances that took place at IAI in the late 1960s, early 1970s. But at the same time, just a few months later, so this treatise was released in June of 1969. In November of 1969 came the occupation of Alcatraz. So the occupation of Alcatraz Island by the Indians of all tribes is considered the beginning of the self-determination era in United States history. The occupation of Alcatraz was also an incredible moment of performance. And what I learned when I was doing an oral history with Peter Jemison, an amazing artist who's also on our Indigenous Steering Council at Forge, is he said, number one, he was there, so he was in the Bay Area at the time, and he witnessed the occupation. He also witnessed their first attempt of an occupation on November 10th. They officially occupied the island on November 19th. And he said, a lot of those people who were part of the occupation were also part of radical street theater in the Bay Area. So everything that they did was done with the knowledge of performance. So the rock became their stage. This proclamation that they co-authored became a kind of script. It had, all of the irony in it. So it was a proclamation to the Great White Father and all his people. They said, we, the Native Americans, reclaim the land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of American Indians by right of discovery. Just turning some things of history on its head. And they also proposed. So they were going to be fair and honorable in their dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of the land. And they were hereby offering the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island 300 years ago, which is Mannahatta. We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than what was paid for Manhattan Island when it was sold, but we also know that land values have risen over the years. So our offer of $1.24 per acre is greater than the 47 cents per acre that the white men are now paying the California Indians for their land. We will give the inhabitants of this island a portion of that land for their own to be held in trust by the American Indian Affairs and by the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs, which doesn't exist, by the way. That was a proposition by them, and I think it's still a good one, especially now. For as long as the sun shall rise and the rivers go down to the sea. They also noticed that there's a lot of similarities to Alcatraz Island, to a lot of native land and a lot of reservations. And some of those similarities were there were no healthcare facilities, there was no fresh running water, it had inadequate sanitation facilities, there was no oil or mineral rights. The soil is rocky and non-productive, and the land did not support game. There were also no education facilities. And then they wrote it all out on a piece of deer hide. So this was the original occupation, and these kind of dual moments became interesting to me, not just because they happened in the same year, but because I was asking myself the question, what were the conditions that were happening at this time that, number one, the Institute of American Indian Arts would come into being as a kind of form of self-determined Native education, and then number two, there would be this kind of proto-land back movement that would happen. This is John Trudell running the nightly radio show, Radio Free Alcatraz, that was broadcast all across the United States. And it actually became a way that the mainstream population became much more intimately aware of Native issues. So it's highly productive. So that was the beginning. That was a beginning for the exhibition. So two paintings by Lloyd Kiva-New that start the exhibition on textile wallpaper designed by Linda Loma-Hoftewa through his textile workshop that was on at Institute of American Indian Arts. This is an original copy of Indian Theater, the document, as well as archival material from the occupation of Alcatraz And then it moves into various kinds of performance, but also the ways in which performance was being represented. So in the far background, you see videos by Spider Women Theatre, who are the longest running Native women's theater troupe in the United States, and they think the longest running women's theater troupe in the United States. So including some of their early works. This was an amazing radical left newspaper called Berkeley Tribe that they were publishing weekly, and they were in a way representing the occupation almost in real time. And then kind of moving through the rooms, and I'll move a bit more quick here through this exhibition, but you have works by James Luna. You see him kind of enacting the famous End of the Trail sculpture, but with 40 of whiskey. AA meeting art history. And his high-tech peace pipe. I had some of the installation crew were younger and some were students, and some hadn't seen a phone like that before. It's really sweet. T-shirts by Casey Adams, this one former landowner. So I was thinking here about how the things that we wear, the things that we dress ourselves in, become a kind of, not necessarily a form of performance, but how they start to become transferred onto canvas, for example, into painting. But a lot of it is clothing. I wanted to include works by Bob Boyer because Bob Boyer was the first native head of an art school here in Canada, started in 1977 in Regina, Saskatchewan. And then there were some commissions or some works that were done just in time for this exhibition, including this incredible large piece by Deanne Whitehawk, which is a canvas that's entirely loom beaded. And it took 8 months to make, with a team that varied between 8 and 13 people, and the artist herself, of course. It's an amazing video based on a score called Rock Piece by Asenayak, who many of you likely know. And beads by Janine Freytna Jutli, which when you install it, they come in these separate packages that are all weighed, and they're all based on the artist's body weight. And they're kind of dispersed throughout the exhibition, but then they were also kind of hidden in the sidewalk, cracks of the sidewalk as you're walking up to the space. Some people kind of thought of it like, I don't know, a talisman or something, and would put some in their pockets as they visited the exhibition. But I was also thinking, as you kind of moved from this place where it was about adornment, then I was thinking about how the body is often represented through its absence in this room. And there was a series of videos by Theogene Cuthand in the video screening room. This is an amazing one. If you can get a trailer, I think you could probably see the full thing if you ask VTape. It's called Two Spirit Introductory Special, and it's a lot of things that are mostly offered for $19.99 that are really helpful, for people's journey and also finding companionship and love in 2015. Musicality also became important in this exhibition. So one, there was a lot of representation of song, a lot of representation of dance, including when our songs and dances were banned, like in the Potlatch records that you can see here on the back wall by Sonia Sue, that their number is the equivalent for the number of years that the potlatch was banned under the Indian Act here, which was 63 years. And then other ones like this one by Marie Watt called Remembering Song, that's all based on the lyrics of a single song that then are stitched by a collaborative group. And I came across this label called Indian Records, where a non-native man had driven himself with a recording device all across different native communities and created these records starting in 1963, so a little bit before 1969. So I was able, his son then found a lot of the unsold records in their garage and was really interested in getting them out in the world, so was selling them for fairly cheap through different record stores in Oklahoma and things like that. So I was able to get a full copy and then another copy that anyone could play, so the Indian records became a kind of soundtrack for the exhibition. Many of the works like this one by Maria Hupfield were sculptures that were then later performed, so she came through the course of the exhibition and performed them, so things shifted and changed. This is a installation that was dedicated to not only Wendy, who many of you know, because she's well known here, especially in Montreal, but also Walter Scott, who's the author of Wendy. When this exhibition was on, it was also when the MFA program was on at Bard, so I deliberately chose a lot of pages that dealt with that anxiety of being an MFA student, as well as a lot of bad decisions that Wendy, does over the course of her life and continues to do. And, just this extreme anxiety, as you can see here. This multi-breasted bunny by Gabe Laurendale Hill that was entirely filled with tobacco created a kind of scent for the exhibition. And then this wild installation by New Red Order, who we also commissioned at Forge to announce our transfer to be an official not-for-profit. And New Red Order are a public secret society. You can join them if you dial, and we had a red phone in there, 1-888-NEW-RED-1. You can dial anytime. You can dial right now if you want. It's just like a series of prompts, so you can become part of this public secret society as well. But what they're interested in is the fact that, the origins of the United States are actually a kind of form of Indian impersonators. So the Boston Tea Party dressed up as really badly, in fact, as Mohawk people, because they thought then the Mohawks would be blamed for that and not the white men who were just being bad. So they work a lot through proxies who represent them as part of this public secret society, but they also have a lot of merch. And they run a land back magazine called Never Settle. This is an installation view with Suzanne Kite's work, Eric Paul Reed, and Charlene Vickers. And again, what was really important about these works is the ways in which they were interacted with and performed. So this is a day-long performance by Eric Paul Reed with these works. And Nico Williams, who's co-curated an exhibition at FOFA Gallery here, just to a shout out, I was able to see it today. This is Nico's caution tape, and I was really interested in this because I felt like, this could be used, and we decided to show it curled up like this because, then you could pull it out if there was any kind of land dispute that was going to happen. And Chanupa Hanska Luger's Muir Shield, so I was interested in how, the self-determination movement started in 1969, but then very quickly has evolved into kind of new forms of the enactment of sovereignty. And these were mural shields that were made as part of a workshop that Chanupa led at the No Dapple movement in Standing Rock as part of the artist camp. And for those who might not be aware, it's a pretty tense situation, lasted more than a year. And these mirror shields were then used as a way to reflect the faces back of the private security firms that were hired by the pipeline, as well as the local cops and as well as the state cops. And here, as you circled through the exhibition, you kind of came back to almost its beginning again, which made sense because that's one of the instructions in the original document of Indian theater, is that Indian theater kind of operates like a flattened oval. And then you have a kind of mask, again mirrored, this one by Bo Dick, in relation to the Lloyd Keevan Mass. And on the day of the opening, we were witness to an incredible performance by Rebecca Belmore called Saw Kill. And like all of Rebecca's performances, she took a great deal of time thinking about how she would respond to this place. She spent a great deal of time just walking and thinking about what she was going to do. She finally settled on the fact that she needed a pile of dirt. She needed dried grass. She needed one helper that she could trust, so we brought in her frequent collaborator, Dana Warren, from Vancouver. And she needed water from the local creek, which is a well-known place for Mohican folks. So over the course of the opening, and she started a couple of hours before the exhibition opened, together with Dana Warren, she created this large X out of clay. It became a mark on the museum. And for her, it was a way to honor her grandmother. Her grandmother, she relayed, refused to learn English. She only spoke Anishinaabe-Moan. She refused to write in English, and Rebecca said she would only sign her name as an X. So this is where the work began, and it marked the building up until a couple of months ago when they started expanding their archives. But it was a kind of other mark as well, because when we were searching for that earth, we were told by the Bard Farm that there was a kind of pile that we could use, and so Rebecca started using that earth, and she thought it was perfectly sifted. And the reason that it was sifted, we discovered later, is because it was the remains of an archaeological dig that was documenting more than 5,000 years of Mohican social life on this place. And so in many ways, that's what she marked this place with as well. So I'll end there because I know we're getting to time. So thank you. I think there's time for a few questions if people have them.
It really is.
And I think that we ask if you use the mic because some people are joining via webinar.
That's right.
But I want to say first, thank you all for listening. Thank you for being here. It's nice to see so many friends.
It's us who should be thanking you, Candice, for this impressive and inspiring presentation. I think without further ado, we should open the floor. Questions?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation. I found it really interesting, your comment about being an independent curator and not having to deal with the institution's politics per se, but then when you're tied to an institution, but as an independent curator, then you have to work with different institutions and their politics, which we're seeing nowadays shift quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, how did you navigate that, particularly as an emerging curator? How did you weave through that? When did you decide to continue on, decline, or change things?
Yeah. So it wasn't an entirely accurate statement because I did have one start at an institution, and I'm really grateful for that start. So after Skawanati and I met at the Walter Phillips, I worked there as a curatorial fellow. And then I saw this job posting in Vancouver at Western Front. And I worked at Western Front for a little over 4 years as the director of the gallery. It's a really amazing institution. It started in the late 60s by artists who were deeply suspicious of the economy of art, also deeply embedded in the Fluxus movement. And because of that suspicion, they only made space for a gallery, I think, 3 years into their evolution as a kind of collective. And it's only 500 square feet, so tiny, tiny gallery space. And they also had this revolving leadership. So that meant that every year, a kind of different member of Western Front would become the director for that year. And they would kind of cycle through that way. So, that was kind of fascinating to me because it meant that you kind of never had one person always calling the shots. It had to be deeply collaborative. in a way that wasn't always like super effective at decision making. And when I joined, you know, we were all directors and we were all departments of one. And so it meant that we collaborated with like new music and performance, and you know, so actually that was my immersion into an institution. Except for, you know, those kinds of artist-run centers, they exist, but they're often not modeled at any kind of higher levels. So I'd say that a lot of what I learned from there, kind of tried to transpose at Forge to try to have, let's say, like a non-hierarchical environment, a responsive environment, an environment that I feel like institutions often aren't very subjective necessarily. They're not good at being transparent. They're not good at admitting fault. They're not good at speaking from a kind of place of vulnerability, let's say. So it was after Western Front that I kind of became more, like, took on different fellowships, which meant you could kind of have one foot in and one foot out and always feel like you could speak from where you were going to speak from because you didn't have as much to lose. But let's say that I always, when I'm navigating something, especially when it starts to feel tricky, I talk to artists about it, but I also think about, you know, is this a situation that I can start to leverage for their benefit? And if it feels like I can't, then, you know, it's not worth doing in a way. But another kind of institution that I didn't talk about at all, that I've been involved with a lot, is the biennial. And so it's a kind of temporary institution where a kind of team is formed for a very particular purpose to make an exhibition. And I have to say I really like working that way. So also thinking about that as a model for Forge, but not the same kind of frantic pace that a lot of biennials have to operate on. So yeah, thank you for that question. It's good.
Anyone else?
People are whispering.
Hi again. I was just really inspired by the way that you worked and got these ancestral pieces that are in archives. And that's such a difficult thing to do, unless you're you, maybe. But I'm just curious how... I find right now it's very difficult to do because you have to present a whole idea and check all these boxes, and institutions are very wary about lending these things out to folks. And so yeah, I'm curious, how did you start kind of massaging an institution to let you borrow these things?
Yeah, you have to start gently because you don't want to seem like a threat, right? You know, the one, there's some tricky things, like Tanya's piece with the rain gut parka, you know, looks very simple, but it took more than a year to negotiate that. It took her visiting her, going, developing this relationship of trust. But then a big negotiation is that, you know, a lot of institutions, not only are there sometimes like fear around the materials that we've used traditionally, which is a lot of, you know, animal, a lot of natural materials, a lot of materials that really respond differently to environments. So to even have that uncovered and just kind of laid like that was a kind of big negotiation as well. So I'd say that it's more about the methodology of relationship building than kind of thinking about that end game. But then the other thing that we did too, and I think you have to, is and all of those are individuals, but we had 2 other backups. Because when we lost the Met loan, then we went to Manitoba, but then we had a couple of other options as backups, and it's sad. The first time I ever entered collections, it was actually at the Royal Ontario Museum, and we were really treated with suspicion. And to me, I think that happens more and more because they know that our heritage is their wealth. And it's sad to me because it creates another level of alienation for those items, right? So not only they're alienated or, let's say, homesick because they're not in their traditional homes, but then there's not only these kind of like barriers of so-called care that's set up, but then there's like very few opportunities where there can be real intimacy. So I feel like I'm really interested in those processes that allow for that intimacy to happen, but it takes a lot of time. So, yeah.
I have a question about when you sell an artwork, like your artwork to an institution.
Mm-hmm.
And I am represented by a gallery, and I do have some work in institutions, and
Mm-hmm.
I made conditions saying that I have to be allowed to borrow it if you want to buy this.
Yeah.
And do you think they really mean it? Like, do you think I'll be able to borrow it?
Do you have it in writing?
No.
You need to get it in writing.
Yeah, so maybe not. But that, I was just wondering, like, how do you
Yeah.
get around that? Because they seem so possessive. Like, I know they want to preserve it
Yeah.
and keep it safe,
Yeah.
but I want to show it too, right?
Yeah, I would recommend that you work on, and some people in this room might have this, a kind of contract for sale
Yeah.
when something's acquired, and that is one of the conditions of its acquisition. You as an artist can put on conditions for its acquisition. And it sounds like you've said this orally, but then, you know, people often change roles in institutions, and so then your oral agreement is only as good as that person's memory and that they're there. So yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah. But I say you can absolutely do it, but you have to do it in writing. Yeah. And not after they've given you the money before. You have to do all your negotiating before. That's when you have the most agency.
I'm green, so I'm learning.
Konalcic, I just wanted to ask how we can support your work at Forge Project.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for asking that. So Forge Project is now a nonprofit. We transitioned to be a nonprofit last year. And if anyone's interested, New Red Order did a great video. This is not it, but this is Forge again. That shows different ways to support. So I would say, you know, it would be, if you're interested in working with us on the journal, that's one way to support us as an Indigenous knowledge maker. Applying for the fellowship. If you are someone more of means, we have a really bright purple button on our website where you can donate. So that's another way to support us. But I also think another way to support us is to think about how some of the models that we've introduced are transferable. You know, could they work at your institution? You know, could 10% of the entry fees at the Musée Contemporain, you know, go back to Ganawage? I don't know, just putting things out there.
Noted. I think there may be a time limit, Annie, to our residency in this room. It's 25 to 9. So I think we're going to draw the evening to an end now. So Candice, again, thank you so much for your generosity and inspiring remarks. It's been a tremendous pleasure. I hope we don't have to wait another 10 years to see you again in person. It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much. To everyone, just a reminder that next week at McGill's Moot Court, Faculty of Law is a Meg-only lecture. And our exhibition, Tino Segal, This Situation, closes on March 29th. That's at Galerie Lucam. We have a new exhibition at the MAC called Skyscrapers by the Roots. And we're going to grab a quick bite, very quick, and then meeting at N sur Maquet later. If you think of new questions to ask Candice or want to meet, say hi, please join us. Okay, have a great evening. Thank you. Bye.